Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I am very excited to do the Victorian Literature Journey Tag. So this tag was created by Roz, one of my fellow co-hosts for Victober, and her daughter Tilly, and it is a fantastic series of questions all about your personal journey with Victorian literature. It was based off of a different tag for Shakespeare or Shaketember, and they discuss all of that in their videos. I will link their original videos down below so that you can see them if you haven't already, but this is going around BookTube, so perhaps you've already taken a look. I can't wait to do this one though, so let's get into the questions. The first question is, what was your first experience reading Victorian literature and how was it? So I think Black Beauty was the first piece of Victorian literature that I ever read, and I don't have very strong memories of it, besides that I thought it was very sad. Also, I consider A Little Princess one of my first pieces of Victorian literature. It's not really Victorian, kind of. It was published in 1905, which is not Victorian, but it is an expanded version of a short story, which was published in the Victorian era, and I absolutely loved it. I categorized Black Beauty and A Little Princess with a lot of older books. Things like Pollyanna, Pippi Longstocking, The Rats of Nim. I didn't really distinguish between the different time periods in which they were written. I just categorized them in my head as older literature, not contemporary. And so I think I didn't really understand or appreciate that it was Victorian literature. The first piece of literature that I read that I did recognize as Victorian and as something different than just old literature was Jane Eyre. I read that one in 9th grade in high school. Not actually in high school, just while I was in high school. I really loved my reading of Jane Eyre. I identified with Jane, which I think I'll talk about in a later question, and it was just a wonderful introduction to Victorian literature. And then in 10th grade, I read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for school, and that was a wonderful introduction to Victorian literature in a different way because I learned a little more about the time period and about some of the themes that occur in Victorian literature. And then I read Wuthering Heights at some point, and I don't quite remember when. Did I read Wuthering Heights before Jane Eyre? I remember reading Pride and Prejudice, which is not Victorian, but then Pride and Prejudice made me want to read Wuthering Heights for some reason, because I thought they were both romances, and I did not get Wuthering Heights at all the first time I read it. I remember thinking that both Catherines were the same person. I did not understand the different generational divides or follow the plot of what was happening at all. Question number 2. Has the reading of a Victorian book ever brought you to tears? If so, tell us more. Definitely. I cry a lot reading, and increasingly so as the years go on. I cry with joy when the characters finally get into a relationship that has been building for the course of the story, like when they kiss or are proposed to or get engaged. And I cry with sadness at certain scenes. And sometimes I just cry because the book is ending or over and I want to read more. The scene that makes me cry without fail every time since the first time I read it, though, is the quintessential scene in Jane Eyre with her friend Helen Burns. It's really heart-wrenching, and I won't say more in case you haven't read the book. But if you haven't read the book, you should. It's not a sad book in general, I don't think, and I don't want to give you the impression it is, but I cry a lot of happy tears during that book too. Question number 3. Are there any people who have played a significant role in your Victorian literature journey? Yes, the first person who has played a major role in my Victorian literature journey was actually one of my friends and her mother, who was an English professor. Her mother was introducing her to all of these Victorian books, and she's the friend who was talking about Jane Eyre and made me want to read it for the first time. And then later on, when I was in college, I did have a specific professor who taught many Victorian literature classes, and she's the reason that I enjoyed Middlemarch. She was my first introduction to Dickens, both Great Expectations and A Christmas Carol, which I had never read before college. She taught the Bronte seminar, where I read all of the Bronte books except for The Professor, which just wasn't on the syllabus. She made me fall in love with Victorian literature in a more academic way, and she introduced me to many Victorian names that I didn't know before. And then, of course, since joining BookTube, Katie from Books and Things and Kate Howe have really influenced my Victorian literature journey. Kate Howe introduced me to Elizabeth Gaskell. Katie has made me love Dickens even more and encouraged me to read Our Mutual Friend, which is possibly my favorite Dickens so far, though I haven't read all of them yet. And both of them have introduced me to some of the more obscure Victorian names that I'm aware of today. Question number 4. Do you have a favorite film or TV adaptation of a Victorian book? What about one you would like to see made? So my 2 favorite adaptations at the moment are North and South and Our Mutual Friend, both of which I haven't seen for a while, but absolutely love. I think that they do such a good job of taking the book and putting it on screen. You really feel that industrial factory vibe in North and South, and the Thornton character is just perfectly done. Richard Armitage does a fantastic job. And then in Our Mutual Friend, the way they play with light and dark is really beautiful and makes the piece come together really nicely. I just love those 2 adaptations. I think they do wonders with the original books. I'd really love an adaptation of Agnes Grey. Have they ever made one? I'm really not sure. Oh, you know what I'd really like? I'd actually love an adaptation of the Chronicles of Barsetshire. I know that there's an adaptation of the Barchester Chronicles from the 80s, I think, with Alan Rickman, and that's great, but it only covers the Warden and Barchester Towers. And then there's Dr. Thorne, there's the TV series, and that's great, but it's separate from the Barchester Chronicles. And then I don't think that there are any adaptations of the last 3 books at all. I wish they could do a huge project with 6 separate miniseries and all the characters played by the same people in each miniseries, so you would really get the scope of Trollope's work and feel that interconnectedness of the books. And I realize this would be a massive undertaking, and I don't know if there's interest there on a larger scale. I'm interested, obviously, but I'm not sure if the general public is. Question number 5. Which character in Victorian literature most resembles you, or you identify with most? This is the hardest question. I definitely used to identify with Jane Eyre. Her searching for identity and a place in the world, her external restraint contrasted with her innate spirit and strong sense of self, and her interest in art and portraiture in general. I really identified with her as a teenager, and every time I reread her story, I feel like a teenager again. In terms of a character who I identify with now, I'm not sure. There really isn't any character that I've read recently in Victorian literature who I strongly identify with or who I feel resembles me. Question number 6. Do you have a favorite moment, scene, or line from Victorian literature? Tell us about it or read it to us. Oh boy. Yeah, no, I don't know. There are way too many. Maybe this is the hardest question. If really pressed, I would probably have to say that it's got to be something from Wuthering Heights. There is just such beautiful, almost poetic writing in that book, and I've underlined and dog-eared so much of my copy. I wish I kept better track of my favorite scenes and lines in Victorian literature, and all literature, to be honest. I used to write more down, but there are so many little lines in Victorian literature, especially in Dickens and Trollope, that really resonate with me, that aren't big scenes, but are just funny or witty or really interesting, like weird little metaphors or bits of characterizations or direct addresses to the reader. And I just love that stuff, in their writing especially. Question number 7. Does any Victorian literature intimidate you? If so, what and why? Well, the sheer amount of Victorian literature that I want to read and haven't yet is intimidating for sure. I've read a decent amount, but there are still a lot of big, famous books I haven't gotten to yet, as well as some more obscure books that really interest me. And then individual books. Sylvia's Lovers intimidates me because I've heard that it has some difficult dialogue and that there's a regional dialect in it that can be difficult to understand. And usually for that type of thing, I read an audiobook, but I haven't found a good production for Sylvia's Lovers. I'm also kind of intimidated by George Eliot in general. I feel like she's much more highly literary than some of the other Victorian authors, and I don't know if I get along with her writing style. I liked Middlemarch, but that might have just been because I was reading it in a class in college and really enjoyed the discussions. And I hated The Mill on the Floss, so I'm kind of intimidated to explore the rest of her work. I think I want to, but there are also so many other things I want to read, and she just doesn't seem like a priority whenever I'm picking my next book. Question number 8. What tips would you give to someone early on in their Victorian literature journey? I think my tips are similar or the same as other people's tips, but I'll talk about them anyway. The first is to be mindful of where you're starting. Start with one of the more accessible and approachable pieces of Victorian literature, and a lot of it is really accessible. It doesn't have to be a long book, but it helps if it's something super famous and well-known that you can look up the plot for or watch an adaptation of if you get confused. I think Jane Eyre or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are great places to start. The Picture of Dorian Gray or The Importance of Being Earnest are good for beginners too. Great Expectations or A Christmas Carol might be nice if you're interested in seeing what all the fuss over Dickens is about. It could be helpful to pick something from a genre you know you like. If you're a fan of mysteries, starting with Sherlock Holmes or Wilkie Collins might be more your speed. Some Victorian literature can be dense and hard to understand, but most of it will actually surprise you in how easy it is to read. And if you get bogged down in a word or a sentence, just skip it. You'll get the gist of the story, and I think a lot of people feel like just because Victorian literature is older and taught in schools, you have to really dissect and analyze it. And a lot of Victorian literature has such great themes and characters that do really lend themselves to that. But the plots and the stories and the characters are also just a lot of fun, and it's nice sometimes to read it for that surface level enjoyment. It was, after all, for the most part, written to entertain the masses. I think it's also important to forget about the size of whatever you pick. If it makes you feel better to pick something short, go for it. The big books can seem daunting, I get that, but once you get invested in them, you'll be surprised how quickly you turn the pages to see what happens next. Question number 9. What is your top recommended read for other readers of Victorian literature? Honestly, it depends on the person and how much they've already read and what they've liked best so far. I'm tempted to recommend The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury because it's a wonderful and engaging hidden gem of a book that many people haven't read before. I'd probably recommend Our Mutual Friend because it's possibly my favorite Dickens so far, and unless someone is a Dickens completionist, they might not have read it yet. If they've read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights but nothing else by the Bronte sisters, I'd recommend that they read one of the other Bronte books, probably something by Anne Bronte, who I think is vastly underrated. I also might recommend some short stories by Gaskell or Sheridan Le Fanu because they're fantastic and might not be first on everyone's list. And if they've already read all of those or are very interested in a specific genre, I could probably come up with more. I guess it really just depends on the conversation we have about what they've read and enjoyed in the past. Question number 10, tag people. This tag has been going around and a lot of people have done it already. So if you are watching and have a channel of your own and think that this would be fun to do, consider yourself tagged. So that's all I have for you guys today. Please let me know in the comments down below if you don't have your own channel and haven't done this tag and you want to respond to any of these questions, please do so. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. So yes, let's chat all things Victorian in the comment section. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you guys in another bookish video very soon. Bye!